I watched through the conference room's glass walls as Marcus Henderson stood at the head of the mahogany table, gesturing enthusiastically at the presentation slides that bore my name in tiny, barely visible font at the bottom corner. My revolutionary AI powered customer service platform, the one I'd spent 18 months developing in secret, the one that could transform our struggling tech company overnight, was being pitched to our biggest potential investor as his brainchild. The beauty of this system, Marcus said, his voice carrying that practiced confidence that had made him regional director at 35, is that it learns from every customer interaction, becoming more intuitive and human like with each conversation. I've been working on this concept for over 2 years. 2 years, I almost laughed at the audacity. 2 years ago, Marcus couldn't even figure out how to update his LinkedIn profile without calling IT support. The investor, Janet Morrison from Apex Ventures, leaned forward with obvious interest. This is exactly what the market needs. The scalability potential is enormous. What kind of patent protection do you have? Already filed, Marcus lied smoothly. My legal team is confident we'll have full protection within 6 months. My hands clenched into fists as I stood frozen outside the conference room. There was no legal team. There were no patents filed. There was only me, Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old senior developer who'd been stupid enough to trust her mentor with the most important work of her career. But Marcus didn't know about my unfair advantage. He didn't know that 3 months ago, I'd started documenting everything. Every email, every conversation, every late-night coding session. Most importantly, he didn't know about the backdoor I'd built into the system, the one that would prove once and for all who the real creator was. As Janet Morrison shook Marcus's hand and promised to have a term sheet ready by Friday, I made my decision. I wouldn't just expose his theft, I would destroy him entirely. The path to this moment had been paved with 3 years of subtle manipulation and increasingly blatant exploitation. When I first joined Nexus Technologies, fresh out of MIT with my master's in computer science, Marcus had seemed like the perfect mentor. Charismatic, successful, and seemingly invested in developing young talent, he'd taken me under his wing with promises of rapid advancement and exciting projects. "You've got real potential, Sarah," he'd told me during my first week, his hand lingering just a moment too long on my shoulder. "Stick with me, and I'll make sure you go places in this company." At first, it seemed like he was keeping his promise. He assigned me to high-visibility projects, introduced me to key clients, and made sure my name was mentioned in important meetings. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic began to shift. It started with small things. My ideas would be presented as our team's concepts, rather than my individual contributions. Code I'd written would be showcased without attribution. When clients praised the technical innovations, Marcus would accept the compliments with a modest smile, never correcting their assumption that he was the mastermind behind the work. "Leadership isn't about individual glory," he'd explain when I questioned the lack of recognition. "It's about elevating the entire team. Your work is still valued, Sarah. Don't let ego get in the way of professional growth." I convinced myself he was right. After all, I was learning, gaining experience, building relationships. What did it matter who got the credit as long as I was advancing my career? But the exploitation escalated. Marcus began assigning me increasingly complex projects, while simultaneously undermining my confidence. He'd criticize my presentation skills in front of colleagues, suggest that my ideas needed refinement before they were ready for client consumption, and gradually position himself as the necessary filter between my raw talent and the polished results the company needed. "You're brilliant with the technical stuff," he'd say, "but you need to understand the business side. Let me handle the strategy and client relations while you focus on what you do best, the coding." The worst part was how he made me grateful for his guidance. He'd frame his theft as mentorship, his manipulation as professional development. When I worked weekends to meet impossible deadlines he'd set, he'd praise my dedication. When I stayed late to fix problems he'd created through his interference, he'd commend my problem-solving skills. The AI customer service platform had been my attempt to break free from this cycle. I'd conceived it during a particularly frustrating client meeting where Marcus had promised capabilities our current system couldn't deliver. Instead of admitting the limitations, he'd looked directly at me and said, "Sarah will figure out how to make it work. She always does." That night, I'd started sketching out the architecture for something revolutionary, a customer service AI that could truly understand context, emotion, and nuance. Not just another chatbot, but a system that could genuinely replace human agents while providing superior service. I knew it could transform not just our company, but the entire industry. I'd made one critical mistake. I'd shared my early prototypes with Marcus, believing that his business acumen could help me position the idea properly within the company. I'd presented it as a collaborative effort, seeking his input on market strategy and implementation timelines. "This is brilliant, Sarah," he'd said, examining my wireframes and technical specifications. "Absolutely brilliant. But you need to be careful about how you present this. The executive team isn't ready for this kind of innovation. They need to be educated gradually." So I'd continued working in secret, refining the algorithm, building robust testing protocols, creating comprehensive documentation. I'd worked nights and weekends, sacrificing my social life and personal relationships to perfect something that could secure both our futures. But 3 months ago, I'd overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Marcus had been talking to someone. I later learned it was his brother, a patent attorney, about intellectual property strategies for individual contributors. "The key is making sure everything is properly documented as company work product," he'd said. "If an employee develops something using company resources and company time, it belongs to the company. And as the supervising manager, I'm the natural point person for commercializing those innovations." That's when I'd realized the truth. Marcus had never seen me as a protege or a collaboration partner. I was a resource to be exploited, a talented developer whose work could fuel his advancement while keeping me trapped in a subordinate role. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd underestimated exactly how brilliant I was, and he'd never bothered to understand the full scope of my technical capabilities. While he'd been focused on stealing my ideas, I'd been building something much more sophisticated than he realized. Not just an AI system, but an entire business infrastructure that could operate independently of Nexus technologies. More importantly, I'd been documenting everything. Every conversation, every email, every code commit had been meticulously recorded and backed up to secure servers he didn't know existed. I had proof of my authorship, proof of his theft, and proof of his systematic pattern of exploitation. As I watched him conclude his presentation to Janet Morrison, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Marcus thought he'd won, thought he'd successfully stolen my life's work and claimed it as his own. But he'd actually just handed me the ammunition I needed to destroy not just his career, but his entire life. The student was about to become the master, and the lesson was going to be brutal. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my cramped studio apartment, surrounded by 3 monitors and enough coffee to power a small city, making the most important decision of my career. I could expose Marcus's theft through corporate channels, hope that HR would take action, and pray that justice would somehow prevail within a system designed to protect people like him. Or I could take control of my own destiny and turn his betrayal into my liberation. By dawn, I'd made my choice. I wasn't going to be another brilliant woman whose ideas were stolen by mediocre men. I was going to use every advantage I had: my technical skills, my documentation, and most importantly, the complete AI system that existed only on my personal servers, to build something that would make Marcus's version look like a child's toy. The first step was gathering intelligence. Over the next week, I systematically mapped out every aspect of Marcus's operation. I monitored his emails — the fool had never changed the default password on his laptop — tracked his client communications, and documented his complete ignorance of the technical details he was claiming to have created. The picture that emerged was both pathetic and infuriating. Marcus's version of my AI system was essentially a facade. Impressive-looking demonstrations built on shallow scripts that could fool investors in a controlled presentation, but would crumble under real-world implementation. He was literally trying to sell vaporware, using my reputation and documentation as proof of concept. But he'd made several critical errors that would soon become his downfall. First, he'd promised Janet Morrison a working prototype within 30 days, something impossible without access to my actual codebase. Second, he'd signed a preliminary agreement that included specific performance benchmarks my real system could meet, but his fake version never could. Third, and most damaging, he'd claimed personal authorship of innovations that were documented across dozens of industry publications and patent applications, all filed under my name over the past 18 months. While Marcus was busy playing CEO in waiting, I was quietly setting up the infrastructure for my own company. I incorporated Chen Industries as a Delaware C Corp, established business banking, and began reaching out to the network of contacts I'd built during my 3 years at Nexus. I was careful to present myself as an independent consultant rather than a competing entity, at least until I was ready to strike. The breakthrough came during my second week of preparation. I was analyzing Marcus's presentation materials when I discovered something that made my blood run cold and my strategic mind light up with possibilities. He hadn't just stolen my AI system, he'd also appropriated my client research, my market analysis, and even my 5-year strategic roadmap for the industry. But in his arrogance and technical ignorance, he'd made copies of documents that contained embedded metadata, hidden watermarks, and digital signatures that irrefutably proved my authorship. Every slide in his presentation, every chart in his business plan, every projection in his financial model contained forensic evidence that would hold up in any legal proceeding. More importantly, I realized that Marcus's timeline was about to collide with reality in spectacular fashion. Janet Morrison wasn't just any investor. She was known for conducting rigorous due diligence and demanding live demonstrations of technology claims. When Marcus inevitably failed to deliver a working system in 30 days, she wouldn't just walk away. She'd actively warn other investors about the fraud, effectively blacklisting him from the entire venture capital community. But I wasn't content to simply watch Marcus destroy himself through his own incompetence. I wanted him to understand exactly who had orchestrated his downfall and why. I wanted him to know that his victim had become his destroyer, that his mentee had become his master, and that every relationship he'd built on stolen work was about to crumble into ash. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after his presentation to Janet Morrison, I implemented the first phase of my plan. I sent a carefully crafted email to Marcus, ostensibly seeking clarification about my role in the upcoming project implementation. "Hi, Marcus," I wrote. "I wanted to confirm my understanding of the technical requirements for the AI system you presented to Apex Ventures. Based on the timeline Janet Morrison mentioned, you'll need a fully functional prototype demonstrating natural language processing, emotional intelligence recognition, and real-time learning capabilities within 30 days. I'm excited to contribute to this project and wanted to make sure I understand exactly what deliverables you're expecting from my team. Could we schedule a technical review meeting early next week? Best regards, Sarah." The beauty of this message was its apparent innocence. To anyone else, it would look like a diligent employee seeking clarity about project expectations. But to Marcus, it would be a terrifying reminder that his stolen presentation had created promises he couldn't possibly keep without my help. Help that I was subtly indicating might not be as unconditional as he'd assumed. His response came within 20 minutes, and the panic was barely concealed beneath his usual authoritative tone. "Sarah, let's discuss this Monday morning. There may have been some miscommunication about the timeline and scope. We should align on realistic deliverables before moving forward." Miscommunication, realistic deliverables. The man who'd confidently promised a revolutionary AI system to one of the most sophisticated investors in Silicon Valley was already trying to manage expectations and shift blame. That weekend, while Marcus was presumably trying to figure out how to deliver on promises he didn't understand, I was putting the finishing touches on something that would change everything. A complete, working, market-ready AI customer service platform that was everything he'd claimed and more. But this wasn't just about proving I could build what he'd stolen. This was about demonstrating that I could build it better, faster, and more comprehensively than he'd ever imagined possible. My system didn't just meet the benchmarks he'd promised Janet Morrison. It exceeded them by orders of magnitude. Monday morning was going to be very interesting indeed. Marcus's office felt smaller than usual when I walked in Monday morning, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of confident smile that had once been his trademark. He was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by printouts of technical documentation he clearly didn't understand, looking like a man who'd just realized he was drowning in waters far deeper than he'd anticipated. "Sarah, thanks for coming in early," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. I've been reviewing the technical requirements, and I think we need to recalibrate our approach to this project. Absolutely, I replied, setting my tablet on his desk and taking a seat across from him. I've actually been doing some additional research over the weekend, and I think I can help clarify exactly what we're dealing with. I opened my tablet and began walking him through a detailed technical breakdown of everything he'd promised Janet Morrison. With each specification I outlined, the natural language processing algorithms, the emotional intelligence recognition protocols, the real-time learning capabilities. I watched his face grow paler. Now, the timeline you've committed to is certainly ambitious. I continued in the same helpful tone I'd used when I was actually trying to support his success. Building these systems from scratch would typically require 18 to 24 months with a full development team. But since you mentioned in the presentation that you've already been working on this for 2 years, I assume you have substantial existing code base we can build from? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus fidgeted with his pen, avoiding eye contact, clearly trying to figure out how to admit he had nothing without revealing that he'd been lying to our biggest potential investor. The thing is, Sarah, he finally said, my development approach has been more conceptual up to this point, more strategic and architectural than implementation focused. I've been waiting for the right team to execute the vision. I see, I said, nodding thoughtfully. So, when you told Janet Morrison that you'd already filed for patent protection, you were referring to provisional applications based on conceptual frameworks rather than actual working code? Another long pause. Something like that, yes. I smiled. Not the supportive smile of a loyal subordinate, but the predatory smile of someone who just confirmed their opponent had walked directly into a trap. Marcus, I think there might be a more serious problem here than just timeline management, I said, my voice losing its helpful tone and becoming coldly professional. I've been reviewing the presentation materials you shared with Apex Ventures, and I've identified some concerning inconsistencies. I turned my tablet toward him and began scrolling through side-by-side comparisons of his presentation slides and documentation I'd published in industry journals over the past year. The similarities weren't just striking, they were identical down to specific technical diagrams and architectural frameworks. This diagram of the neural network architecture, I said, pointing to one of his slides, appears to be directly copied from my paper in the Journal of Applied AI published 8 months ago. And this performance benchmark table matches exactly with my research published at the International Conference on Customer Experience Technology. Marcus's face went through several color changes, settling on an unhealthy grayish pallor. Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding the collaborative nature of our work environment. When team members contribute to shared projects— Marcus, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut steel. I need you to stop talking and listen very carefully. I have documentation proving that every technical innovation in your presentation to Apex Ventures was developed by me during my personal time using my personal resources. I have time-stamped code repositories, email communications, and publication records that establish a clear timeline of my independent research and development. I stood up, looming over his desk with the kind of authority I'd never been allowed to display in this office before. More importantly, I have evidence that you've systematically misrepresented my work as your own to external investors, which constitutes securities fraud. You've also violated multiple intellectual property laws by attempting to commercialize innovations you didn't create and don't own. The transformation in Marcus was remarkable to watch. The confident mentor who'd spent 3 years making me feel small and inadequate was now shrinking in his chair, his usual commanding presence deflating like a punctured balloon. Sarah, let's not get carried away here, he said, trying to recover some semblance of control. Even if there have been some attribution issues, we can work this out internally. No need to involve lawyers or make this more complicated than it needs to be. Actually, Marcus, it's already much more complicated than you realize, I said, pulling up another document on my tablet. Because while you've been trying to figure out how to explain to Janet Morrison that you can't deliver what you promised, I've been building the actual system you claim to have created. I turned the tablet toward him again, this time showing him a live demonstration of my AI customer service platform. His eyes widened as he watched the system handle complex customer inquiries with the kind of sophisticated natural language processing and emotional intelligence he'd only been able to describe in theoretical terms. This is a fully functional, market-ready implementation of everything you promised Apex Ventures, plus capabilities you didn't even know were possible, I continued. It's been tested with real customer data, optimized for enterprise-scale deployment, and protected by patents that were filed under my name 6 months ago. Marcus stared at the screen, and I could see him trying to process the implications. He'd stolen my ideas, but I'd kept the actual implementation. He'd made promises based on my work, but I controlled the technology needed to fulfill those promises. He'd tried to cut me out of my own success, but he'd actually just isolated himself from the only person who could save him. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled again, and this time it was the smile of someone who'd spent 3 years planning the perfect revenge. "I want you to understand exactly what you've done and exactly what's going to happen next," I said. "You stole my life's work and tried to build your career on my innovations. You manipulated me, exploited my talent, and took credit for achievements that belonged to me. You made me feel small and grateful for scraps from my own table." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But your biggest mistake was assuming I was just another brilliant woman you could use and discard. You never bothered to understand what I was really capable of, or you would have realized that stealing from me was like trying to steal fire from a dragon." I straightened up and began gathering my materials. "Here's what happens next, Marcus. You're going to call Janet Morrison this afternoon and withdraw your proposal, citing technical difficulties. You're going to formally acknowledge my authorship of all innovations currently attributed to you in company records. And you're going to provide a letter of recommendation that accurately reflects my contributions to every project we've worked on together." "And if I don't?" he asked, though we both knew he didn't have any leverage left. "If you don't, I'll file both criminal and civil complaints for intellectual property theft, securities fraud, and a pattern of workplace exploitation that violates multiple federal employment laws. I'll share my documentation with every investor, client, and industry publication that's had contact with Nexus Technologies. And I'll make sure that everyone in Silicon Valley knows exactly who Marcus Henderson really is and what he's really capable of achieving without stealing other people's work." I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "But Marcus, even if you do everything I've asked, it won't save you. Because while you've been playing politics and stealing credit, I've been building something that's going to make Nexus Technologies look like a lemonade stand. In 6 months, when Chen Industries launches the most advanced AI customer service platform the market has ever seen, you'll understand the difference between a thief and a creator." I left him sitting in his office, surrounded by technical documentation he couldn't understand, contemplating promises he couldn't keep, and finally beginning to realize that he'd just been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd spent 3 years underestimating. The real fun was just beginning. The next 6 weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, with each movement building toward a crescendo that would leave Marcus's professional life in ruins. But I wasn't content with simple revenge. I wanted total victory, the kind of comprehensive triumph that would serve as both personal vindication and professional liberation. Marcus, to his credit, initially tried to salvage the situation through damage control. He called Janet Morrison that same afternoon and attempted to renegotiate the timeline for his promised AI system, citing unexpected technical complexities that required additional development time. But Janet Morrison hadn't built her reputation by accepting vague excuses from entrepreneurs who couldn't deliver on their promises. I know this because Janet Morrison called me directly 3 days later. "Miss Chen," she said when I answered my phone, "I hope you don't mind the direct contact, but I've been conducting some due diligence on the AI customer service platform that was presented to me last week, and your name keeps appearing in connection with the underlying technology." My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my voice carefully neutral. "I'd be happy to discuss my research in that area, Miss Morrison. What specific aspects are you interested in learning about?" "All of them," she said, with the kind of directness that had made her one of the most feared and respected investors in Silicon Valley. "I've reviewed your published papers, your patent applications, and your technical presentations at industry conferences. Unless I'm very much mistaken, you're the actual inventor of the technology Meister Henderson was claiming as his own work." I took a deep breath, realizing that this moment would define not just my immediate future, but potentially my entire career. Miss Morrison, I think it would be more appropriate for us to discuss this in person. Are you available for a meeting this week? I'm available right now, she replied. My office or yours? 2 hours later, I was sitting in the Apex Ventures conference room, the same space where Marcus had made his fraudulent presentation, facing Janet Morrison across a table covered with printouts of my research, my patents, and my published work. But this time, I wasn't watching through glass walls as someone else took credit for my innovations. I was the one making the presentation. Let me be direct, Miss Chen, Janet Morrison said after I'd finished walking her through my actual AI system. Not Marcus's theatrical demo, but the real platform with real capabilities and real market potential. Based on everything I've seen, Mr. Henderson attempted to defraud my firm by misrepresenting stolen intellectual property as his own work. Is that your understanding of the situation? That's correct, I replied. And I have comprehensive documentation proving the timeline of my development work, the independent nature of my research, and the systematic pattern of misappropriation that led to his presentation to your firm. Janet Morrison leaned back in her chair, and I could see her mind working through the implications. Miss Chen, I'm prepared to offer you the same investment terms I discussed with Mr. Henderson, but directed toward your company rather than his. Are you interested in discussing a partnership with Apex Ventures? The offer was everything I'd dreamed of and more than I'd dared to hope for. But I'd learned from watching Marcus that success in Silicon Valley required more than just technical brilliance. It required strategic thinking, market timing, and the ability to maximize every advantage. I'm very interested, Miss Morrison, I said, but I'd like to propose a slightly different structure that I think would better serve both our interests. Over the next hour, we outlined a partnership that would give me not just the funding I needed, but the credibility and market access that would allow Chen Industries to become a direct competitor to Nexus Technologies. More importantly, Janet Morrison agreed to serve as an advisor and strategic partner, bringing her extensive network and reputation to support my company's growth. But the most satisfying part of our conversation came when she asked about my plans for addressing Marcus's attempted fraud. I'm not vindictive, Miss Morrison, I said, which was only partially true, but I believe in accountability. Mr. Henderson's behavior represents a pattern of exploitation that has harmed not just me, but potentially other employees and business partners. I think the industry needs to understand what really happened here. I agree completely, she replied. And I think you should know that I've already begun sharing my concerns about Mr. Henderson with other investors in my network. Word travels fast in Silicon Valley, especially when it involves intellectual property theft and securities fraud. By the time I left the Apex Ventures office, I had a term sheet for $2 million in Series A funding, a partnership agreement with one of the most respected investors in the industry, and the satisfaction of knowing that Marcus's reputation was already beginning to crumble among the people who mattered most. But I wasn't finished with him yet, not even close. While Marcus was presumably trying to figure out how to explain his situation to the Nexus Technologies executive team, I was implementing the next phase of my plan, systematically recruiting his most talented employees and his most valuable clients. And it started with casual conversations with colleagues I'd worked closely with over the years. I didn't need to badmouth Marcus or reveal the details of our conflict. I simply let it be known that I was starting my own company and would be interested in discussing opportunities with anyone who might be looking for a new challenge. The response was overwhelming. It turned out that Marcus's pattern of taking credit for other people's work wasn't limited to his relationship with me. Nearly every developer, designer, and project manager who'd worked under his supervision had their own stories of stolen ideas, manipulated presentations, and credit that never materialized. Within 2 weeks, I had provisional commitments from 5 of Nexus Technologies' most skilled employees, including the lead systems architect who'd been responsible for implementing my designs and the customer success manager who'd built relationships with our most important clients. But the real coup came when I approached David Kumar, Nexus Technologies' head of sales and Marcus's closest ally within the company. David and I had never worked closely together, but I knew he was frustrated with Marcus's tendency to overpromise capabilities that the technical team couldn't deliver. Sarah, he said, when I reached out to schedule a confidential meeting, I was hoping you'd call. I've been hearing some interesting rumors about what really happened with the Apex Ventures presentation. We met at a coffee shop in Palo Alto, far from the Nexus Technologies office, and I spent an hour walking David through the complete timeline of Marcus's theft, his attempted fraud, and the inevitable collapse that was coming. The way I see it, I concluded, you have two choices. You can stay with Marcus and go down with his ship, or you can join a company that actually has the technology and the backing to succeed in this market. David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told him. Finally, he looked up with the kind of smile that indicated he'd just made a significant decision. Sarah, I've spent 2 years trying to sell products that barely work to clients who deserve better. If you're offering me the chance to sell something revolutionary to people who will actually benefit from it, then I'm in. Within a month of my confrontation with Marcus, I had not only secured funding and recruited key personnel, but I'd also begun the process of directly competing with Nexus Technologies for their most valuable client relationships. And because my team included people who'd actually built and maintained the systems Marcus had been claiming credit for, we could offer continuity and expertise that Nexus couldn't match without their stolen innovations. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd planned, but the most satisfying moment was still to come. Because while Marcus had been focused on trying to contain the damage from his failed presentation and departing employees, he'd missed the most important development of all. Chen Industries was about to launch publicly with a demonstration that would reveal the full scope of his deception to the entire industry. The TechCrunch Disrupt conference in San Francisco had always been Marcus's favorite venue for showcasing Nexus Technologies' latest innovations. For 3 consecutive years, he'd used the event to position himself as a thought leader in customer experience technology, delivering presentations that featured work I'd created but could never claim. This year would be different. This year, I would be the one on stage. The irony was perfect. While Marcus was struggling to explain to the Nexus Technologies board why their AI initiative had collapsed and why their best employees were leaving for a mysterious competitor, I was preparing to unveil Chen Industries at the same conference where he'd built his stolen reputation. But I wasn't content with simple role reversal. I wanted Marcus to be in the audience when I revealed not just my technology, but the complete story of how I'd gone from exploited employee to successful entrepreneur. I wanted him to watch as I demonstrated capabilities that made his fraudulent promises look like amateur hour. And I wanted the entire tech industry to understand exactly what kind of person Marcus Henderson really was. The challenge was ensuring he'd actually attend. Marcus was too smart to voluntarily put himself in a position where he'd be publicly humiliated, especially once he learned that I was speaking at the conference. So I needed to create circumstances that would make his attendance both necessary and inevitable. The solution came through David Kumar, who'd maintained his position at Nexus Technologies while secretly preparing to join Chen Industries. As head of sales, David had legitimate reasons to attend industry conferences, and he could provide real-time intelligence about Marcus's plans and reactions. "He's definitely planning to be there," David reported during one of our clandestine planning meetings. "The board is putting pressure on him to explain what happened with the AI project, and he's convinced that he can rebuild his credibility by positioning Nexus as a leader in emerging customer experience trends." "Perfect," I replied. "Make sure he knows that there's going to be a major announcement about AI customer service technology. Don't mention Chen Industries specifically, but create enough curiosity that he'll feel like he needs to be there to understand the competitive landscape." The week leading up to TechCrunch Disrupt was a masterclass in strategic psychological warfare. Through David and other industry contacts, I carefully orchestrated a series of rumors and hints that suggested something significant was happening in the AI customer service space. I made sure Marcus heard whispers about a stealth startup with revolutionary technology and major investor backing for an industry-changing platform. Meanwhile, my actual preparations were proceeding flawlessly. The Chen Industries presentation had been refined to perfection, combining live technical demonstrations with compelling business case studies and a narrative structure that would lead inevitably to the revelation of Marcus's theft and my triumph. But the most important element was the surprise guest I'd convinced to join me on stage, Janet Morrison from Apex Ventures, who would be publicly announcing her investment in Chen Industries and sharing her perspective on the intellectual property fraud she'd uncovered during her due diligence process. The morning of my presentation, I arrived at the Moscone Center 3 hours early to oversee the final technical setup and rehearse the key transitions one more time. Everything had to be perfect because this wasn't just a product launch, it was the culmination of months of planning and the moment when Marcus would finally understand the full scope of his defeat. I spotted him in the audience about 20 minutes before my scheduled presentation time, sitting in the third row with a notebook and pen, clearly expecting to gather competitive intelligence about whatever new technology was about to be unveiled. He looked confident, even relaxed, completely unaware that he was about to witness his own professional execution. When I walked onto the stage and began speaking, I watched his face change from mild curiosity to confusion to growing alarm as he gradually realized what was happening. 3 years ago, I began. I joined a tech company as a senior developer with dreams of building technology that could transform how businesses interact with their customers. I believed that innovation, hard work, and technical excellence would be enough to succeed in Silicon Valley. I clicked to my first slide, which showed a timeline of AI customer service development over the past decade. I was wrong. I learned that in some organizations, the people who create breakthrough technology aren't the ones who get credit for it. I learned that brilliant ideas can be stolen, that years of work can be appropriated, and that the person who presents the innovation isn't always the person who invented it. Marcus was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and looking around as if trying to determine whether other audience members were connecting my words to his situation. But I also learned something else, I continued, advancing to a slide that showed the Chen Industries logo for the first time. I learned that the best response to theft isn't just exposure, it's excellence. When someone steals your ideas, you don't just prove they stole them, you prove that you can build something better than they ever could. For the next 30 minutes, I delivered a presentation that redefined what was possible in AI customer service technology. I demonstrated capabilities that exceeded every benchmark Marcus had promised Janet Morrison, showed real-world implementations that solved problems he'd never even understood, and outlined a business strategy that positioned Chen Industries as the definitive leader in the emerging market. But the climax came when Janet Morrison joined me on stage to announce Apex Ventures' investment and share her perspective on the due diligence process that had led to our partnership. When I first encountered this technology 6 months ago, Janet said, addressing the audience with her characteristic directness, it was presented to me by someone who claimed to have invented it. But when I investigated the actual origins of the innovation, I discovered that the real inventor was someone else entirely, someone who had been systematically denied credit for her own work. The audience was riveted, and I could see people throughout the auditorium turning to look at Marcus, who had gone pale and was clearly trying to figure out how to leave without drawing more attention to himself. This experience taught me an important lesson about due diligence in the tech industry, Janet continued. When someone presents revolutionary technology, it's essential to verify not just what they're claiming, but who actually created it. Because the difference between a brilliant inventor and a skilled presenter can mean the difference between a transformative investment and a devastating fraud. When Janet finished speaking and left the stage, I delivered the final segment of my presentation, a detailed timeline showing the development of my AI platform, including publication dates for my research, patent filing dates for my innovations, and code repository timestamps that proved my authorship of every technical advancement Marcus had tried to claim. The technology you've seen today represents 3 years of independent research and development, I said, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since taking the stage. It was created entirely outside of any corporate environment, using personal resources and personal time. It belongs completely and unambiguously to me and to Chen Industries. I paused, letting the implications sink in throughout the auditorium. But this presentation isn't just about showcasing revolutionary technology. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that the people who create innovations are the ones who receive credit for them. And it's about demonstrating that theft isn't just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. I clicked to my final slide, which showed side-by-side comparisons of Marcus's fraudulent presentation materials and my original published research, complete with timestamps and metadata that proved the chain of theft. 6 months ago, these innovations were misrepresented to investors as the work of someone else. Today, the real creator is launching a company that will make those misrepresentations irrelevant. Because when you steal fire from a dragon, you don't get the fire. You just make an enemy who's smarter, more motivated, and more dangerous than you ever imagined. The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I was watching Marcus struggle to his feet and push his way toward the exit, his face flushed with humiliation and his career effectively over. Several audience members were already pulling out their phones, undoubtedly sharing the news that one of Silicon Valley's supposed rising stars had just been exposed as a fraud on one of the industry's biggest stages. But even as I savored the moment of his public destruction, I knew that the real victory was still to come. Because while Marcus was fleeing the conference in disgrace, I was about to begin the final phase of my plan, systematically destroying everything he'd built on stolen foundations. The aftermath of TechCrunch Disrupt exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Within 24 hours, the video of my presentation had been viewed over 200,000 times, shared across every major tech publication, and dissected by industry analysts who were calling it a masterclass in how to destroy a competitor through superior execution. But the real impact was happening behind the scenes, where the relationships and reputation Marcus had built over years of theft and manipulation were crumbling with stunning speed. The tech industry, for all its talk of innovation and disruption, was still fundamentally a relationship-based business, where trust and credibility were the most valuable currencies. And Marcus had just been revealed as someone who couldn't be trusted with either. The first domino fell within hours of my presentation. TechCrunch published a detailed investigative piece that traced the complete timeline of Marcus's theft, including interviews with former Nexus Technologies employees who confirmed the pattern of appropriation and manipulation. The article didn't just expose his theft of my work, it revealed a systematic pattern of exploitation that stretched back to his earliest days in management. Henderson's rise through the ranks at Nexus Technologies appears to have been built entirely on claiming credit for innovations developed by his subordinates, the article concluded. Sources within the company describe a culture of fear where talented developers were afraid to challenge his appropriation of their work, and where questioning his authority could result in career sabotage. The second domino was more personal and infinitely more satisfying. David Kumar called me the morning after my presentation with news that made my victory complete. "Sarah, you need to know what happened at Nexus this morning," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "Marcus was called into an emergency board meeting at 7 a.m. I don't know all the details, but I heard shouting from the conference room, and he came out 30 minutes later carrying a box of his personal belongings." "Fired?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Fired, blacklisted, and facing potential legal action for misrepresentation of company assets," David confirmed. "The board is apparently concerned about liability issues related to his fraudulent investor presentations, and they want to distance the company from him as quickly as possible." But Marcus's termination was just the beginning of his problems. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched with profound satisfaction as every aspect of his professional life systematically collapsed. The venture capital community, which operated on reputation and personal relationships, effectively ostracized him overnight. Janet Morrison's warnings to other investors had created a whisper campaign that made Marcus unemployable in any leadership role at any tech company seeking funding. When word spread that he'd attempted to defraud Apex Ventures with stolen intellectual property, every major VC firm in Silicon Valley quietly added his name to their internal blacklists. His professional network, built largely on relationships with people who believed they were working with an innovative technologist, evaporated as former allies distanced themselves from the scandal. LinkedIn endorsements disappeared, conference speaking invitations were rescinded, and industry publications that had previously featured his thought leadership published corrections and retractions. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: his own family. Marcus's brother, the patent attorney who'd advised him on intellectual property strategies for individual contributors, published a public statement disavowing any knowledge of or involvement in his theft scheme. The statement, clearly designed to protect his own legal practice from association with the scandal, effectively destroyed Marcus's last remaining source of professional support. Within a month of my TechCrunch presentation, Marcus Henderson had gone from regional director at a respected tech company to unemployable pariah facing potential criminal charges for securities fraud and intellectual property theft. Meanwhile, Chen Industries was experiencing the kind of explosive growth that most startups only dream about. The publicity from my presentation had generated more than 2,000 qualified leads from potential enterprise clients, deployed 12 acquisition offers from major tech companies, and follow-up investment interest from 3 additional venture capital firms. But more importantly, the core team I'd assembled was delivering on every promise I'd made. The AI customer service platform wasn't just meeting our technical specifications, it was exceeding them, learning and improving with each deployment in ways that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Our first major client was Morrison Financial, a mid-sized investment management firm that had been struggling with customer service scalability issues. Janet Morrison had made the introduction, and within 2 weeks of implementation, our AI system was handling 80% of their customer inquiries with satisfaction scores that exceeded their previous human-staffed service by 15%. This isn't just better technology, their customer experience director told me during our first quarterly review. This is technology that actually understands what our clients need and responds with the kind of sophistication we could never afford to provide with human agents. But the victory that meant the most to me came 6 months after TechCrunch, when Nexus Technologies reached out through intermediaries to inquire about licensing my AI platform for their own customer service operations. The irony was exquisite. The company that had allowed Marcus to steal my innovations was now asking to pay for access to the technology they'd let him claim as his own. They were effectively admitting that their stolen version was worthless and that they needed the real thing to remain competitive. I declined their offer, of course, not out of spite, though I'd be lying if I said spite wasn't part of the motivation, but because I had bigger plans for Chen Industries than simply licensing technology to companies that had enabled intellectual property theft. Instead, I used their inquiry as leverage to recruit their most talented remaining developers and to acquire 3 of their smaller client accounts that were looking for more reliable service providers. Within 8 months of Marcus's termination, Nexus Technologies had lost 40% of their technical staff and 25% of their revenue to competitors, primarily Chen Industries. But my ultimate victory wasn't just professional, it was personal. Because while Marcus was struggling to find even entry-level employment in an industry that had permanently marked him as untrustworthy, I was building something that would outlast both of us, a company culture where innovation was rewarded, where credit was given, where credit was due, and where brilliant people could build extraordinary things without fear of exploitation. 2 years after TechCrunch Disrupt, I stood in the corner office of Chen Industries' new headquarters in San Francisco's financial district, looking out at a view that encompassed both the Bay Bridge and the bustling streets where Marcus Henderson was now reportedly working as a freelance technical writer for small startups that couldn't afford to do proper background checks. The transformation had been remarkable. Chen Industries had grown from a 1-person operation run out of my studio apartment to a 200-employee company with enterprise clients across 3 continents. Our AI customer service platform had become the industry standard, with major corporations paying millions for implementations that delivered measurable improvements in customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. But the success metrics that mattered most to me weren't financial, they were human. The company culture I'd built was everything I'd dreamed of during my darkest days under Marcus's exploitation. Every innovation was properly attributed, every contribution was recognized, and every employee had the opportunity to grow based on their actual merit rather than their ability to navigate office politics. The vindication was complete when MIT invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual Technology and Innovation Conference, the same event where Marcus had once given a presentation about collaborative leadership in technical organizations that featured examples of my work without attribution. This time, I was the one on stage sharing the real story of how breakthrough innovations were created and explaining why the tech industry needed to do better at protecting and rewarding the people who actually built the future. Success in technology isn't just about having great ideas, I told the audience of students, faculty, and industry professionals. It's about creating environments where great ideas can flourish, where the people who create innovations are the ones who benefit from them, and where theft is met with the kind of consequences that make it unprofitable. In the audience, I spotted several faces I recognized from my Nexus Technologies days. former colleagues who had reached out over the past year to congratulate me on my success and to share their own stories of working under Marcus's toxic management style. Many of them had gone on to find better opportunities at companies that valued their contributions, liberated from the environment of fear and exploitation that Marcus had created. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the networking reception after my keynote, when a young woman approached me with the kind of nervous energy I remembered from my own early career. "Miss Chen," she said, "I'm a graduate student in computer science, and I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I've been working on some AI research that I think could be really innovative, but my advisor has been pressuring me to add his name to my publications, even though he hasn't contributed to the technical work." I looked at this brilliant young woman, probably not much younger than I'd been when I first met Marcus, and saw myself reflected in her uncertainty and determination. "What's your name?" I asked. "Lisa Park," she replied. "Lisa, let me give you some advice that I wish someone had given me when I was starting out," I said. "Your work belongs to you. Your ideas belong to you. Your innovations belong to you. Don't let anyone convince you that exploitation is mentorship or that theft is collaboration." I handed her my business card. "And if you decide you want to work somewhere that actually values innovation and treats brilliant people like the assets they are, give me a call. Chen Industries is always looking for talented researchers who want to build the future instead of just talking about it." As I watched Lisa walk away with my card, I realized that my victory over Marcus had become something much larger than personal revenge. It had become a model for how the tech industry could change, how brilliant people could protect themselves from exploitation, and how innovation could flourish when creators were empowered rather than exploited. Marcus Henderson had tried to steal my fire and claim my innovations as his own. Instead, he'd created an enemy who was smarter, more motivated, and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. He'd turned a grateful mentee into a competitor who systematically destroyed everything he'd built on stolen foundations. But more importantly, he'd inadvertently created something that would outlast both of us, proof that theft isn't just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. Because when you steal from someone brilliant enough to create breakthrough innovations, you're not just making an enemy, you're making an enemy who has the skills, the motivation, and the moral authority to destroy you completely. And in Silicon Valley, where reputation and relationships determine everything, that kind of destruction is always permanent. The student had become the master, the victim had become the victor, and the thief had learned too late that some fires are too dangerous to steal. Epilogue, 5 years later. I received the news on a Tuesday morning while reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office overlooking the San Francisco Bay. My assistant knocked and entered with a mixture of professional composure and barely contained amusement. "Miss Chen," she said, "I thought you should know that Marcus Henderson just applied for a junior developer position at our Austin office." I looked up from my reports, genuinely surprised. In the 5 years since TechCrunch Disrupt, I'd occasionally heard updates about Marcus's declining fortunes through the Silicon Valley gossip network. His failed attempts to start consulting firms, his rejections from increasingly desperate job applications, his eventual retreat from the tech industry entirely. But I hadn't expected him to surface in my world again. "Did he know he was applying to Chen Industries?" I asked. "Apparently not," she replied. "According to HR, he submitted his application through an automated job board system and seemed genuinely shocked when he realized where he'd applied during the initial screening call." I leaned back in my chair, considering the cosmic irony of the situation. Marcus Henderson, who had once tried to steal my life's work and claim my innovations as his own, was now desperate enough to seek employment at the company I'd built from the ashes of his betrayal. "What did HR tell him?" I asked. "They followed standard protocol and informed him that his application would be reviewed by the hiring committee," she said. "They didn't mention that you would personally review all applications for technical positions." I smiled, remembering the terrified look on Marcus's face as he'd fled TechCrunch Disrupt 5 years earlier. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and manipulated brilliant subordinates was now reduced to applying for entry-level positions at companies that wouldn't have existed without the innovations he'd tried to steal. "Schedule a meeting with the Austin office hiring committee for this afternoon," I said. "I want to review Mr. Henderson's application personally." That evening, I sat in my home office reading through Marcus's resume and cover letter with the same careful attention I'd once devoted to documenting his theft. The transformation was remarkable and pathetic in equal measure. The confident executive who had once claimed credit for revolutionary AI innovations was now describing himself as a detail-oriented developer with experience in legacy system maintenance and technical documentation. His employment history told the story of his complete professional collapse. After his termination from Nexus Technologies, he'd managed to find temporary contract work at increasingly smaller companies for decreasing rates. The gaps between jobs had grown longer, the responsibilities had become more menial, and the desperation in his cover letter was palpable. "I am eager to contribute to your team's success," he wrote, "and I believe my experience with collaborative development environments would be valuable to your organization's growth objectives." Collaborative development environments. The euphemism was almost insulting in its transparency. Marcus was still trying to spin his history of theft and exploitation as teamwork and leadership. But what struck me most was the final paragraph of his cover letter. "I am particularly interested in opportunities to work with innovative AI technologies, as I have long believed this field represents the future of customer experience solutions." Even now, even after everything that had happened, Marcus was still trying to claim some connection to the work he'd stolen from me. He couldn't help himself. The compulsion to appropriate other people's innovations was apparently hardwired into his personality. I made my decision. The next morning, I called the Austin office hiring manager personally. "I've reviewed Marcus Henderson's application," I told her, "and I'd like you to bring him in for an interview." "Are you sure, Miss Chen?" she asked, clearly aware of the history between us. "I can't imagine this would be comfortable for either of you." 2 weeks later, I found myself staring at a computer screen showing Marcus Henderson sitting in a conference room in our Austin office, looking older, grayer, and significantly more defeated than the man who had once tried to steal my future. He was wearing an ill-fitting suit that had probably been expensive once but now looked tired and dated, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone who desperately needed a job. "Hello, Marcus," I said, watching him flinch slightly as he recognized my voice. "Thank you for your interest in joining Chen Industries." The silence stretched between us for a long moment as he processed the situation. I could see him calculating whether to acknowledge our history or pretend this was just another routine job interview. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice carrying none of its former authority, "I didn't realize you would be conducting the interview personally." "I make it a point to personally interview all candidates for senior technical positions," I said, which was true. "Though I notice you've applied for a junior developer role. That seems like quite a departure from your previous experience in leadership positions." Marcus's discomfort was visible even through the video connection. "I've decided to focus more on hands-on technical work," he said. "I think there's value in getting back to the fundamentals of software development." "I see," I replied. "And what specifically interests you about working for Chen Industries?" "Your company has built an impressive reputation for innovation in AI customer service technology," he said, the words clearly painful for him to speak. "I'd like to contribute to that success in whatever capacity would be most valuable." I leaned forward, studying his face on the screen. "Marcus, I want to be direct with you. Do you understand why this conversation is happening? Do you understand what Chen Industries is and how it came to exist?" Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, "I understand." "Then you understand that this company was built on the innovations you tried to steal from me. You understand that every employee here, every client we serve, every dollar of revenue we generate exists because I refuse to let your theft define my future." Marcus nodded, unable to meet my eyes even through the video connection. "So help me understand," I continued, "why you think I would hire the man who tried to destroy my career to work for the company I built from the wreckage of his betrayal." For a moment, I thought he might hang up or simply walk out of the interview. Instead, he took a shaky breath and did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He told the truth. "Because I have nowhere else to go," he said. "Because every other company in this industry knows what I did and they won't hire me. Because I've spent 5 years trying to rebuild my career and I've failed at everything I've attempted." because you're the only person in Silicon Valley who might understand that I've learned from my mistakes. I studied his face, seeing genuine remorse for perhaps the first time since I'd known him. And what exactly have you learned, Marcus? I learned that stealing other people's work doesn't make you successful. It makes you a fraud, he said. I learned that taking credit for innovations you didn't create doesn't make you a leader. It makes you a thief. I learned that the people you exploit don't just disappear, they remember. And they're often more capable than you ever imagined. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. And I learned that you were always the brilliant one in our working relationship. I was just the parasite who was stupid enough to think I could steal fire from a dragon. I smiled at the callback to my TechCrunch presentation, impressed despite myself that he'd remembered the metaphor. That's quite an education, I said. But understanding your mistakes doesn't necessarily qualify you to work for the company you tried to destroy. What makes you think you deserve a second chance? I don't, he said immediately. I don't deserve a second chance and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm asking for the opportunity to do something useful with whatever's left of my career. To contribute to something meaningful instead of just trying to survive. I considered his words, weighing them against 5 years of satisfaction at his professional destruction and the knowledge that hiring him would be seen as either magnanimous leadership or spectacular weakness by everyone who knew our history. Marcus, I said finally, I'm going to offer you a position at Chen Industries. His eyes widened with shock and something that might have been hope. But not the junior developer role you applied for, I continued. I'm going to offer you a position in our documentation department, working under the supervision of Lisa Park. You remember her, the graduate student I hired 5 years ago, who now leads our research publications team? I watched him process the implications. Lisa Park, the young woman who'd approached me at MIT about her advisor trying to steal credit for her work, had become one of Chen Industries' most valuable employees. She would now be Marcus's boss, creating a perfect circle of justice that would remind him daily of the consequences of exploitation. Your job will be to document the innovations created by our actual engineers and researchers, ensuring that proper attribution is maintained in all our technical publications, I said. You'll be responsible for making sure that credit is always given where credit is due. The irony was exquisite, and Marcus understood it completely. The salary is $65,000 per year, I continued, which is probably less than you were making as an intern 15 years ago. You'll have no direct reports, no decision-making authority, and no opportunity for advancement without demonstrating genuine technical contributions. I paused, letting the full scope of his professional degradation sink in. But you'll have the opportunity to contribute to meaningful work, to support innovations that actually help people, and to rebuild whatever's left of your professional integrity. Do you accept? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his pride against his desperation. Finally, he nodded. I accept, he said. And Sarah, thank you. Don't thank me yet, I replied. Thank me in 2 years if you've managed to prove that you can add value to other people's work instead of stealing it. After the call ended, I sat in my office contemplating the strange symmetry of the moment. 5 years ago, Marcus Henderson had tried to steal my innovations and claim my future as his own. Today, he was joining my company as a junior employee, working under the supervision of someone who represented everything he'd tried to exploit and destroy. It wasn't just revenge. It was transformation. The man who had once built his career on theft was now going to spend his remaining professional years ensuring that other people's innovations were properly protected and attributed. The predator had become the guardian, the exploiter had become the advocate, but more than that, it was proof that justice, while sometimes delayed, was ultimately inevitable. Marcus had spent 5 years learning that in Silicon Valley, reputation was everything, trust was precious, and theft was ultimately self-destructive. He'd discovered that stealing fire from a dragon didn't make you powerful. It just made you a target. As I watched the sun set over San Francisco Bay from my corner office, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from that terrified young developer who'd once been grateful for scraps from her own table. I'd built something that would outlast both Marcus and me. A company culture where innovation was rewarded, where credit was given where it was due, and where brilliant people could build extraordinary things without fear of exploitation. The student had become the master. The victim had become the victor, and the thief had learned, finally and completely, that some fires are too dangerous to steal. But that redemption, unlike revenge, was always possible for those willing to earn it.